investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakelin Property Advisor. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for episode 69 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So welcome back for 2024. It's certainly looking to be a great year within the Melbourne property market, and hopefully there'll be many things for us to discuss and talk about throughout the year. But starting off, probably the hottest topic that we're seeing at the moment within the market is the rental side of things. So I thought today we could go through ways that investors can take advantage of the heat that is in the rental market at the moment. And there's no one better to talk to about this than Jarrod Telfer. Thanks, Gordo, for joining me.
Thanks, Jarrod. Good to be back for another year.
So I guess just before we get into the guts of this, what are some of the things that we're seeing at the moment within the rental market in terms of activity, strength, compared to it was still reasonably strong finishing off last year, but what have you seen from your conversations and through properties that we've helped some of our clients lease out this year?
Well, one thing leads to another, and that is huge numbers that open for inspections.
Yeah.
Ridiculously big numbers. And that's moving, that's obviously then flowing through to some very good leases being signed, I suppose, or rent increases.
Yeah.
So that's normal for this time of year.
Yeah.
Mid-January through to mid-March. But it's sort of been supercharged by an extremely low vacancy rate, which we saw starting to emerge last year.
Yep.
And just a total lack of supply. Yeah.
So those that are going, and we'll probably get more into those that are coming out of a lease is what we want to look at today, but for those that are, perhaps their previous tenant has decided to vacate and they've hit the market, or for those that have perhaps just bought a property and are renting it out for the first time, really the key things there are just make sure that you are chasing a premium at this time of year. You can, and I've had this conversation with a number of our clients that we purchased properties for late last year, particularly if you've got a bit of early access, you can afford to be bullish at this time of the year.
Yeah.
So you don't need to leave anything on the table. And as long as you're prepared after a week, perhaps, if you are being a bit too bullish, to review it.
Yeah. I'm not seeing too many of those this year.
Yeah.
What we're suggesting to clients, as of late last year, properties that we've purchased that are then settling, and we've engineered it as best we can to settle at this time of year to take advantage of that rental market. We're suggesting that we push that little bit further.
Yep.
And having said that asking rent, in a number of cases this last week or so since we've been back, has actually been when the property managers have provided the details of the subsequent lease, it's been more again.
Right.
And usually that's because the asking rent has been, the applications, there are a number of applications being received, and prospective tenants are without being induced to do so.
Which we know you can't do.
You can't do
days.
that,
Yep.
and that's fair enough. But they're off their own bat. They're saying, look,
themselves.
I see value greater than that.
Yeah.
Could be, another $10, $20 a week, $30 a week on, say, properties around $650, $700 advertised.
Just to secure something.
Just to secure something, yeah, because they understand. They understand that that's the market at the moment, unfortunately.
So let's look into then when a lease, this is what we wanted to talk about today, where a lease is coming to an end and you need to have and it's perhaps been a 12-month lease. And so the rental market more often than not, well, we certainly know in the last 12 months has changed significantly over a 12-month period. So what are some of this, what are the scenarios, what can investors do to ensure that they maximise their rental return?
Yeah, I think first of all, there's two choices that you can have, and this will be prompted by the property manager.
Sorry, before you go on, I just want to make sure too from everyone listening that this will be very generic. These discussions that we'll have today, it's not going to be a one size fits all. You need to have specific conversations with your advisors, whether they be property advisors, whether they be property managers. You need to have those discussions to see what suits your situation. So I just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you've got two choices. Property manager rings you up and says, look, lease is expiring in a couple of months' time. What do you want to do? Mm-hmm. Well, you can either roll it on, just keep it onto a periodic, and that's fine. And you can have a rent increase on a periodic lease, of course. Yep. And there might be good reason to do so. You might be looking to owner occupy in the short term or with an eye to selling in the short term.
Yep.
And more often than not, our advice to clients is sell and market the property vacant, you've got greater control over the sale process, presentation, etc. So that's a legitimate option.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, of course, want the security of a 12-month lease, not only tenants but owners.
Yeah.
There's a bit more security of and a surety of rental income for the 12 months hence. So what do you do to try to maximise your position, I suppose? Well, timing is important.
Yep.
And so you start these discussions. A good property manager will always initiate this
In advance. Yeah.
Reason being, there needs to be 60 days notice anyway. If there is to be a rent increase, it needs to be existing tenant needs to be notified of that. They can't just have it dropped on them.
Yeah.
So you need to do that in any case. Terms are important.
Yep.
So it doesn't have to be a standard 12-month.
Yeah.
You might find if the property is, say, coming up and a 12-month lease would coincide with winter, you might want to say, no, look, offer a 15-month lease.
Yep.
So we get it outside of winter and get it into the early part of spring. Or ideally, engineer it so a property becomes vacant, or at least the discussions with the tenant then are initiated at this time of year.
Yep.
So mid-January through to mid-March.
Yep.
And in this market, a lot of tenants would probably say, yeah, look, I'd value that extra security anyway.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be in this position fighting with 50 or 60 other people at an open for inspection in 12 months' time.
The only thing to bear in mind if you're going much longer than 12 months is if there's any realm of consideration to selling the property, you've got to be careful because you don't want to have to be trying to sell a property that's under a fixed term lease. It just limits your market too much. But if there's no thought around that, then I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Client of ours we've been discussing with for a little while now. He's had a sensible approach, and that's perhaps tying an improvement to a new lease and a rent increase. So in this case, it's a split system air conditioner.
Which is pretty common, particularly for some of the older properties, and they haven't putting them in. It's not always as easy though with with some of the older style apartments to just slap in a split system. And because where the inverter and things has to go, sometimes it can be a complicated and expensive exercise.
Can be. There's usually an answer.
Yeah, okay.
Be it on the roof, on the dead side, I like to refer to it as the dead side of the building where all of the services go, sometimes on the balcony.
Yeah.
There's usually a way around it. And in this case, $3,000 to $3,500 adds a bit of value. This is a top floor apartment. He's had a continuity of tenant for so long, he hasn't really had an opportunity to do much upgrade to it.
Yep.
And that will certainly appeal to the next tenant when his existing tenant does decide to vacate. So that's a possibility. And you add a little bit of capital value and marketability to the property if and when you come to sell. Yep. So that could be a negotiating point as well. Mm-hmm. And of course, you want to the central to the discussion is in this market an increase to the rent.
Yeah.
So how do you go about that? Well, a lot of times it's just the subtlety in the communication to the tenant. In that you want a 12-month lease and you want a rent increase usually.
Yes.
So I think it can look a bit heavy-handed if a property manager goes back to the tenant and says, "Listen, we're happy to love you to stay on. Rent increase to X, but if you're not prepared to sign a lease, then it's going to be more than that, closer to market at a higher level." Looks a bit heavy-handed if you're to sort of not a gun to the head of the tenant, but so perhaps go around the other way and say, look, market rent is X. You've been a great tenant. You've been great to deal with, rent paid on time, etc. My owner recognises that. If you're prepared to provide them with the assurity of some security of a 12-month lease, they're more than happy to reduce the rent down that little bit. So you're
still getting your increase.
You're still getting a good increase.
So plucking figures, and we don't like to use too many figures, but if you're at $430 a week and it should be $500, well, you might go and say, well, we think it should be $500 a week, but we're prepared to give it to you at $480 a week.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And $500 a week is market. It's not.
We're not inflating that like you might get on a reserve price on auction day where it passes in.
Yeah, and I think that's fair too.
Yeah.
In that, if you've got somebody in there that's looking after your property and are good to deal with, well, there's plenty of justification for keeping something a little bit below market.
Yeah.
And but with the understanding too that quid pro quo, if your circumstances are such that you want to stay on, well, periodic gives the tenant much more flexibility than it does at times the owner.
Yep.
And our owner would like a 12-month lease, and that's fair enough too.
So I guess the other thing though too is that you don't want to be, the important part here is you don't want to be letting things slip too much. And we've had a few discussions lately about rental increases, and sometimes it just gets to a point, I think, where that tenant, or renter I should say, is no longer the right renter for that property, in that they just can't afford market rent.
Yeah.
So you want to keep them and you want to look after them, but the market's changed significantly in that period of time. So maybe they just need to consider something different. And as an owner, you can't be afraid to move on from a tenant. It can't just be about keeping them and, we'll reduce it a little bit. Because if you keep doing that at every interval, you're going to start to slip well and truly behind market levels. And it makes it a lot harder to bridge that gap.
Yeah, it does. And particularly in this market where, COVID is hopefully in the rearview mirror, but there is still some lag effects and holdovers from COVID, where not only were there no rent increases, but oftentimes there was significant rent reductions. And that has become the norm for a lot of tenants.
Yeah.
And they've adjusted their lifestyle, their spending patterns around that. And now there's been a supersized increase, and there can be a massive gap to bridge. That just may not be
feasible anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good. Were there any other examples or points that you wanted to raise in relation to ways that that investors can maximise things?
Well, it's probably more around that that bridging of the gap, I suppose, and whether it's sensible to be
pushing hard,
or you just pull back that little bit. And I think that what needs to be considered, and in certain circumstances, again, quite apart from, in inverted commas, rewarding the tenant for looking after the property and being a good tenant by bringing it a little bit below market, if you do push too hard, and yes, sure, some properties are just not fit, they're no longer suitable for that tenant. But if an increase that doesn't push them out of there can be achieved, and it's not too far from market, well, there are advantages to that. Because what has to be factored in, sure, if we're $20 short of where market is, it's $1,000 a year thereabouts that you're leaving on the table, so to speak, as an owner. But you've got to also consider the costs in finding a new tenant. So there's going to be a leasing fee rather than a releasing fee, and justifiably, there's a lot more work from a property manager's perspective to find that new tenant. So that's always a greater expense. That can be, that could be $1,000. Sorry, not $1,000. Probably about anywhere between $750, $850 extra, I suppose, for that. You've then got advertising. And there may well be a short vacancy period as well, as one tenant has transitioned out and a new one comes in. And there also may be a need to, once that tenant goes, particularly if they've been a long-term tenant, it may be needing of new carpet or a coat of paint or just some things, upgrade for the next tenant. And you could find that by pushing for that extra $1,000 and forcing a tenant out for you to then have to go back into the market to find the new tenant to pay you a market rent, you might be costing yourself twice that again. So it's calibrating it right. So
understanding what those differences are and where it's worth pushing and where it's not. I think but I think in a lot of circumstances those numbers are right, but I think at the moment it's one of the unique times where as a landlord, as an owner, you can probably afford to push a bit harder. There'd be a lot of times in the past where I think the margins just don't justify pushing too hard. $20 a week, I agree, but sometimes it could be as much as $50. And as an owner, you can't be afraid at the moment to say to the tenant, look, sorry, you're just not there. It's just not quite enough. We need to be closer to market value than what you're able to pay. And if you're not able to, then we might have to move on. And that might mean that you have to pay a little bit for leasing fees and for marketing and things, but to get the right property, because like we said before, we might think that $500 a week, as the example, is market, but with the way more. It could be at the moment, because people are paying premium. So although it might be $480 to $500, $510, if you go to market, you might get $530 or $540, and that's not because you can look at comparable rentals and say, this is where they sit, it's because there's nothing else around to rent.
Yeah.
And it just makes it really tough from a tenancy perspective. But it means that there could be options around. So a lot of the times, and we've said this to many clients in the past, where take the conservative option. Just you've got a really good tenant who's paying your rent and you're only a little bit below market, go with it. I'm not saying that you should definitely just say no, bugger it, move on. But I think there's room to be a bit more bullish at the moment.
Yeah, well, we're seeing that particularly at this time, time of year.
And that could change in 2 months' time.
It could.
In that you don't have the same levels of competition. I don't think the rental market's going to slow down anytime soon. But we always knew that mid-January to probably the end of March was always going to be, it's always a competitive market. This year was always going to be extremely competitive, and it has been.
Yeah.
But it will come back a bit by the time we get out of the first quarter. It's just a question of, I don't think it's going to come back to what we would normally see during the year. It'll still be a competitive rental market.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, hopefully that's given people something to think about and some ideas. Obviously, we're always happy to have a chat about ways and means that that we can help in terms of providing advice. But generally, thank you very much for joining Jordan and I for episode 69. Thanks again, Gordo, for coming in.
Pleasure.
And as always, please feel free to share the podcast as far and wide with friends and family and colleagues as you can. We want to really try and ramp things up for this year. And if you would like further information on how to make rewarding property decisions, please visit our website, wakelin.com.au, or give the office a call. And obviously, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.